Cameron Brooks meant to ask a simple question. Standing near the information desk at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, he turned to the woman beside him, a stranger in a tailored coat, and asked which route led fastest to a small coastal town in Oregon. He had no idea she was a billionaire. The instant she heard the name of his destination, Grace Whitmore went completely still. Minutes before her private jet was cleared for takeoff, she canceled the flight, stunning her executive team. No one understood why a powerful CEO would abandon a billion-dollar meeting for a stranger's route. What made a billionaire walk away from her own vast empire to follow a total stranger, stay until the end? Cameron Brooks lived a life that drew no attention at all. He drove an old pickup truck with a dent in the tailgate and rust creeping along the wheel wells, the kind of vehicle nobody looked at twice in a parking garage full of luxury sedans. His clothes were plain, a canvas jacket worn soft at the elbows, jeans that had faded from years of washing, boots that had walked more miles than most people would guess. He carried a single canvas bag over one shoulder, the strap frayed at the edge, and inside it were only the essentials. Nothing extra, nothing for show. Anyone passing him in the terminal that morning would have assumed he was an ordinary traveler, maybe a retired contractor or a man heading out to visit family. Nothing about his quiet posture or unhurried walk suggested that 2 decades earlier he had been considered one of the most brilliant aerospace engineers of his generation. Nothing suggested the patents that once bore his name, the breakthroughs that had shaped an entire industry, or the fact that companies had once fought over the right to hire him. He had walked away from all of it, and he had done so without regret, without looking back, and without ever mentioning it to a soul who did not already know. He moved through the terminal at his own pace, glancing occasionally at the departure boards, in no rush despite the crowds hurrying around him. His destination was a small coastal town in Oregon called Cedar Point, a place most travel guides did not bother to mention, a place that had faded so quietly from relevance that even longtime Oregonians sometimes forgot it existed. To most people, Cedar Point was nothing, a forgotten dot on a map, a town whose best days belonged to a past nobody remembered. But to Cameron, it was the one place in the world that still mattered. He had made this trip only a handful of times over the years, and each visit carried the same quiet weight, the same sense of unfinished business folded gently beneath an ordinary exterior. He did not tell anyone where he was going or why. He simply packed his bag, checked the departure times, and made his way toward the gate the way any anonymous traveler would, blending into the flow of the crowd like a man who had spent a lifetime learning how not to be noticed. While Cameron made his way through the terminal with nothing but a canvas bag and a private purpose, another figure moved through a very different part of the airport entirely. Grace Whitmore arrived through a private entrance reserved for a handful of individuals whose time was considered too valuable to spend waiting in lines. She was flanked by assistants carrying tablets, a security detail scanning the surroundings out of habit, and an advisor reciting the final details of a meeting that was expected to reshape an entire sector of the aerospace industry. Her presence changed the atmosphere of any room she entered, a quiet authority that came from years of building an empire from nothing but ambition and precision. Grace was 37 years old and had spent nearly half her life inside boardrooms, negotiating deals that most executives twice her age would have considered impossible. She ran Whitmore Aerospace, a company her father had founded and she had transformed into one of the most powerful forces in the industry. She was sharp, calculating, and famously difficult to read, the kind of leader who could assess a person's intentions within minutes of meeting them, or so she believed. Every decision she made was deliberate, every conversation a chess move, every relationship measured against its usefulness to the empire she had built with her own hands. Her private jet waited on the tarmac, already fueled, already prepared for a flight that would deliver her to a boardroom filled with investors who trusted her judgment without question. She had built that trust over years of never faltering, never hesitating, never allowing sentiment to interfere with strategy. Nothing in her carefully managed schedule accounted for delay, and nothing in her nature invited distraction. She was a woman entirely in control of her world, moving through the terminal with the practiced calm of someone who had never once doubted the direction of her own life. 2 people occupied the same airport that morning, separated by an invisible wall built from money, power, and circumstance. One carried a canvas bag and a quiet promise he intended to keep. The other carried a portfolio worth billions and a certainty that nothing could surprise her anymore. Neither of them yet understood that the next few minutes would unravel everything they thought they knew, not just about each other, but about the past neither had fully faced. Cameron approached the information desk near his gate, hoping to confirm the fastest route from the regional airport near Cedar Point to the coastline itself, since he had not made the drive in some time. The attendant was busy with another traveler, phone pressed to her ear, papers scattered across the counter. He waited patiently, the way he waited for most things in life, without impatience, without any visible urgency at all. Standing a few feet away was a woman he did not recognize, dressed in a tailored coat, her posture composed in the particular way of someone accustomed to being watched. He had no idea who she was. He simply saw another traveler standing near the desk, someone who might know the area better than he did. Without much thought, he turned toward her. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm and unhurried. "Do you happen to know the fastest route to a town called Cedar Point?" Grace glanced at him, mildly surprised that anyone would approach her so casually, without the practiced deference she usually received. For a moment she considered ignoring the question entirely, the way she ignored most unsolicited conversation. But something about his tone gave her pause, an evenness that did not match the usual nervous energy of strangers who recognized her and wanted something. She answered anyway, giving him a general direction, then found herself asking a question of her own, one she had not planned to ask. "What takes you there?" she said, her curiosity catching her off guard even as the words left her mouth. Cameron considered the question for a moment before answering. "I have a promise to keep," he said simply. He did not elaborate. His voice carried no drama, no performance, just the quiet certainty of a man who meant exactly what he said and nothing more. Grace found herself studying him more closely, searching for the tell she was certain must be there, some flicker of exaggeration or hidden agenda. She found nothing but calm. Then he said the name again, mentioning Cedar Point once more as he thanked her for the directions, and something in Grace's expression shifted entirely. The color seemed to drain slightly from her face. Her fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around the strap of her bag. For the briefest moment, the composed executive who never lost her footing looked as though the ground beneath her had quietly given way. Cameron did not notice. He nodded his thanks, gave a small polite smile, and turned to walk toward his gate, already thinking ahead to the drive from the regional airport to the coast, to the promise waiting for him at the end of that road. He had no idea that the name of a forgotten town had just detonated something inside the composed stranger standing behind him, something buried for 20 years beneath careful smiles and boardroom victories. Grace remained frozen for several seconds after he walked away, watching his retreating back with an expression none of her staff had ever seen on her face before. Her assistant approached, asking if everything was fine, if they were still on schedule for departure. Grace did not answer right away. She was still staring at the space where the stranger had been standing, turning his simple words over in her mind, feeling the past rise up without warning in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday morning. "Cancel the flight," Grace said, her voice quiet but absolute. Her assistant blinked, certain he had misheard. The jet was fueled, the crew was ready, and a boardroom full of investors sat waiting on the other end of that flight, prepared to finalize a deal worth billions of dollars. Grace Whitmore did not cancel flights. She did not delay meetings. She had built her entire reputation on being the one person in any negotiation who never fully blinked first. "I said cancel it," she repeated, already turning away from the gate, her eyes searching the crowd for a glimpse of the man who had just walked off toward another terminal entirely. Her advisor hurried alongside her, listing the consequences in a low, urgent voice. The investors would not wait forever. The board would demand an explanation. Competitors would notice the delay and draw their own conclusions. None of it seemed to register. Grace kept walking, her mind fixed on a single word that had unraveled 20 years of carefully buried history in the span of a heartbeat. "I have to go to Cedar Point," she said finally, more to herself than to anyone listening. "Why?" her assistant asked, struggling to keep pace with her sudden urgency. "What is in Cedar Point?" Grace did not answer. She could not find the words fast enough to explain something she barely understood herself, a feeling that had risen from somewhere deep and unresolved. A name she had not let herself think about in years, suddenly spoken aloud by a stranger who could not have known what it meant to her. She only knew that she needed to see where that road led, and she needed to see it now. Word moved quickly through the private terminal. A camera crew stationed near the executive lounge, there to capture footage of departing dignitaries for a business segment, caught sight of the commotion and began filming without hesitation. Within the hour, clips began circulating online showing the notoriously composed CEO of Whitmore Aerospace abandoning her own flight in visible distress, her security detail trailing behind her, her advisors exchanging bewildered glances. Financial analysts speculated about scandal. Competitors speculated about crisis. Reporters speculated about everything from a hostile takeover to a personal emergency, none of them anywhere close to the truth. Grace ignored all of it, her phone buzzing uselessly in her pocket as she arranged for a smaller aircraft, one that could take her toward the Oregon coast without the fanfare of her usual departures. She did not know exactly what she would find in Cedar Point. She only knew that the name had unlocked something she had spent 2 decades trying to forget, and that a stranger with a canvas bag and a quiet voice was somehow at the center of it. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Grace Whitmore was moving something without a plan, without a strategy, driven by nothing but an instinct she could not explain and did not fully trust. Cedar Point had not changed much in the years since Cameron last walked its narrow streets. The buildings along the main road still wore their faded paint, with a kind of stubborn dignity, storefronts that had closed decades ago standing quietly beside the few that remained open. Salt air drifted up from the shoreline, carrying with it the scent of the sea and the particular stillness of a town that time had mostly forgotten. Cameron breathed it in like a man returning home after a long absence, which in every way that mattered he was. He passed the old research facility first, its windows long boarded, its parking lot cracked and overtaken by weeds. Once it had hummed with activity, engineers and technicians moving purposefully between buildings that had represented the cutting edge of aerospace innovation. Now it stood silent, a monument to something that had been allowed to die. Cameron did not linger there long. His destination lay further down the road, past the lighthouse that still stood watch over the harbor, toward a small museum tucked between a hardware store and a shuttered diner. Inside the museum, an older man looked up from behind the counter, and his face broke into a wide, genuine smile the moment he recognized his visitor. The two men embraced like old friends who had weathered years together. No explanation needed, no formalities required. They settled into worn chairs near the back of the museum and talked for a long while, their conversation easy and familiar, the kind shared only by people who trusted each other completely. Grace arrived not long after, having chartered a smaller plane to the regional airport and hired a car for the final stretch of the drive. She kept her distance at first, uncertain what she was even looking for, uncertain why she had come at all. She found herself standing outside the museum, watching through the window as Cameron laughed at something the old man said, his face transformed by an ease she had not seen in him back at the airport. She had never seen him smile like that. It struck her strangely, this simple observation, the way genuine warmth could change a person's entire presence. She lingered outside a while longer, watching the two men speak, noticing how people passing on the sidewalk nodded toward Cameron with obvious respect, how a woman sweeping the steps of a nearby shop called out a greeting that carried real affection. Grace approached an elderly woman sitting on a bench near the harbor, asking carefully about the man inside the museum, framing her question as though she were simply a curious traveler passing through. The woman's expression softened immediately at the mention of his name. If it were not for Cameron, the woman said, this whole town would have disappeared years ago. He never asked for anything in return, never once. Grace thanked her and stepped back, her mind turning over the words slowly, a suspicion beginning to form somewhere beneath her composed exterior. She had come to Cedar Point chasing a feeling she could not name, and now standing outside a small museum in a town that clearly adored a man she had only just met. That feeling was beginning to take a shape she did not want to face. The story that unfolded over the following hours came to Grace in fragments, pieced together through conversations with shopkeepers, the old museum curator, and a retired dock worker who remembered the town in its better years. 20 years earlier, Cedar Point had been home to a research center at the forefront of aerospace innovation, a place where brilliant engineers gathered to solve problems the rest of the industry had not yet imagined tackling. Cameron Brooks had been the youngest and most gifted among them, a man whose ideas seemed to arrive years ahead of everyone else's understanding. He had developed breakthroughs that could have transformed entire systems of flight technology, innovations that companies across the country would have paid enormous sums to acquire. But Cameron had refused every offer, insisting that his work remain tied to the community that had raised him, unwilling to let Cedar Point become nothing more than a footnote in someone else's success story. Then a large corporation arrived with an offer to purchase the research center outright, promising to preserve its operations and protect the town's future. The offer was accepted, papers were signed, and for a brief period it seemed as though Cedar Point's fortunes were secured. But within a year the new owners quietly shut the facility down, citing restructuring and shifting priorities, and left the town to absorb the consequences alone. Jobs disappeared almost overnight. Families who had lived in Cedar Point for generations began moving away in search of work elsewhere. The research center that had once been a source of pride sat empty, its equipment sold off piece by piece, its purpose erased entirely. Cameron had lost more than a career in those months. He had watched an entire community unravel around him, and he had never fully forgiven himself for trusting the wrong people with something so precious. Grace listened to each account with a growing unease she could not shake. Something about the timeline felt uncomfortably close to memories of her own childhood, fragments of conversations she had overheard as a young girl, her father's voice discussing an acquisition that had gone differently than planned. She tried to push the thought aside, telling herself the connection was coincidence, that countless companies had bought and abandoned research facilities over the years. But when she finally asked the museum curator the name of the corporation that had purchased the facility all those years ago, the answer arrived like a blow she had somehow been expecting all along. The name he spoke was one she had known her entire life, printed on business cards, painted across headquarters, spoken in boardrooms with pride and reverence. It was her father's company, the very foundation of everything she had built her life upon. Grace stood motionless outside the museum, for a long moment, the salt wind moving past her, the town she had only just arrived in suddenly feeling like the site of a wound she had never known existed. Everything she believed about her family's legacy had just cracked quietly down the middle, and she was only beginning to understand how deep that fracture ran. Grace returned to her hotel room that night and did not sleep. Instead, she opened her laptop and began digging through decades of archived records, company filings, and internal communications that she had never once thought to examine. She had inherited the company her father built, had spent years running it with unwavering confidence in its foundations, and had never questioned the story she had always been told about its rise to prominence. She started with the acquisition records from 20 years earlier, cross-referencing dates and names until a clearer picture began to emerge. What she found unsettled her more with every passing hour. Meeting minutes revealed that her father had originally intended to keep the Cedar Point Research Center operating exactly as promised, had in fact insisted on protective clauses meant to preserve its staff and its mission for years to come. But somewhere between her father's intentions and the final outcome, a small group of executives beneath him had taken matters into their own hands. Internal memos showed a pattern of falsified performance reports, documents designed to make the research center appear far less productive than it truly was, numbers manipulated to justify a closure that had never needed to happen. Grace read through email after email, watching the deception unfold in real time across the screen, watching men she had once respected orchestrate the destruction of an entire community for reasons that boiled down to simple greed. Worse still, she found evidence that several of Cameron's own patents and research materials had been quietly absorbed into other divisions of the company after his departure, stripped of his name and repackaged as internal innovations. Technologies that had built entire product lines, technologies that had generated enormous profits over the years, traced back to ideas that had never been properly credited or compensated. The company she had spent her life defending had built part of its empire on a foundation of theft. Grace closed the laptop somewhere near dawn, unable to process the weight of what she had uncovered. She had always believed, with the kind of certainty that only comes from never having reason to doubt, that Whitmore Aerospace stood for integrity, that her father's legacy was one worth protecting and continuing. She had built her entire identity around that belief, had made decisions for years based on the assumption that the empire beneath her feet was solid ground. Now she understood that a portion of that ground had been built on betrayal, on the quiet ruin of a town and the erasure of a man whose only offense had been trusting people who did not deserve it. The realization settled into her chest like something physical, heavy, and undeniable. She thought of Cameron's calm voice at the airport, his simple words about keeping a promise, and understood for the first time just how much history had been folded quietly beneath that composure. She sat alone in the dark hotel room as the sun began to rise over the water, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Grace Whitmore did not know what to do next. She found Cameron the next morning standing near the old lighthouse, looking out over water that had witnessed 20 years of quiet grief he had never fully spoken about to anyone. He heard her footsteps on the gravel path and turned, unsurprised somehow to see her there, as though some part of him had known she would come. "I need to apologize," Grace said, her voice stripped of the polish that usually armored every word she spoke in public. "For what my company did to you. To this town. I did not know, but that does not excuse it. I should have known." Cameron studied her for a long moment before answering, his expression unreadable in the pale morning light. "You do not owe me an apology for decisions made by people who acted without your knowledge," he said finally. "That burden was never yours to carry." "But I am carrying it now," Grace said. "I want to make it right." He turned back toward the water, quiet for a while, the waves breaking steadily against the rocks below. "I did not come here to reclaim anything from the past," he said eventually. "I am not interested in blame or restitution. That is not why I made this trip." "Then why?" Grace asked, the question rising from somewhere honest and unguarded, a place she rarely allowed herself to speak from. Cameron's eyes softened as he looked toward the small house visible in the distance, weathered but well kept, standing where it always had. "I came to keep a promise," he said, "to someone who believed in what this town could become long before anyone else did. My wife spent her whole life here. She used to say Cedar Point deserved a future built on knowledge, not on what companies decided it was worth. I promised her before she passed that I would find a way to give this place that chance again, even if it took the rest of my life." Grace felt something break open inside her chest, a grief she had not expected to feel for a woman she had never met, for a promise made in the quiet aftermath of loss. She understood then that Cameron's calm was not indifference. It was devotion, carried patiently across 2 decades, unwavering even when the world had given him every reason to abandon it. Tears rose in her eyes before she could stop them, the first genuine tears she had shed in longer than she could remember, unguarded and unstrategic, belonging to no boardroom performance. Cameron did not move to comfort her, understanding instinctively that she needed the space to feel what she was feeling without interference. He simply stood beside her, looking out at the same water that had held his grief for 20 years. And for the first time, Grace understood exactly what she needed to do next. Grace returned to headquarters with a resolve that startled everyone around her. She called an emergency meeting of the board within hours of landing, walking into the room with none of her usual measured diplomacy, only a folder of documents and an expression that made clear she would not be negotiated out of what she intended to do. The board's reaction was immediate and hostile. Several longtime members argued that dredging up a 20-year-old scandal would devastate the company's reputation, that shareholders would panic, that competitors would seize on the story to poach clients and partners. One executive, a man who had served on the board since before Grace was born, insisted that the past should remain exactly where it was, buried and forgotten, for the good of everyone still standing. Grace listened to every argument without flinching. Then she told them plainly that she had not called the meeting to ask permission. She had called it to inform them of decisions already made. An internal investigation would begin immediately, examining the falsified records from 20 years earlier and any individuals still employed by the company who had participated in the deception. Anyone found responsible, regardless of their current position or tenure, would be terminated. The room erupted into arguments, but Grace remained unmoved, her voice steady even as tempers rose around her. She reminded them that the company had spent decades building its reputation on claims of integrity and innovation, claims that meant nothing if built atop a foundation of theft and ruin. If Whitmore Aerospace wanted to survive as something worth respecting, it needed to start by telling the truth, however costly that truth might be in the short term. Over the following weeks, the investigation moved forward exactly as Grace had promised. Several senior executives, men who had spent decades insulated by seniority and quiet loyalty from those above them, were quietly removed from their positions once evidence confirmed their roles in the original deception. Legal counsel drafted a formal public statement acknowledging the company's failures in the Cedar Point matter, an admission Grace insisted be worded with complete honesty rather than the usual language of careful evasion. She personally oversaw the effort to restore Cameron's name to every patent and piece of research that had been stripped of proper credit over the years, working with the legal department late into the night to ensure the correction was thorough and permanent. It was not a simple process, and it was not a popular one among certain factions within the company, but Grace pushed forward regardless, driven by a conviction that had nothing to do with public relations and everything to do with what she now understood to be right. Investors grew nervous. Stock analysts speculated about instability at the top, but Grace held her ground through every difficult conversation, understanding that some decisions mattered more than quarterly projections, and that the empire she had inherited would mean nothing if she could not look at its foundation without shame. Grace chose to hold the public announcement in Cedar Point itself, standing on a small stage erected near the harbor where the old research center had once thrived. Reporters and camera crews filled the square, drawn by weeks of speculation about the scandal quietly unfolding inside one of the industry's most powerful companies. Townspeople gathered as well, curious and cautious, many of them still carrying the scars of what had happened to their community 20 years earlier. Grace stepped up to the microphone without notes, without the usual polished script her communications team had prepared for her. She spoke plainly about what her company had done, about the falsified reports and the stolen credit, about the town that had been sacrificed for the sake of numbers on a quarterly report. She did not soften the truth or bury it beneath corporate language. She simply told it, fully and without excuse. Then she spoke Cameron's name, clearly and deliberately, in front of every camera in the square. She explained who he truly was, the brilliance behind the breakthroughs that had shaped so much of modern aerospace technology. The man whose contributions had been erased from a legacy that should have carried his name from the very beginning. She announced that his work would finally receive full and permanent recognition, restored in every record where it had been stripped away. The crowd rose to their feet almost as one, applause breaking out across the square, townspeople embracing each other, with tears in their eyes, decades of quiet resentment finally giving way to something like vindication. Cameron stood near the back of the gathering, uncomfortable with the attention but unable to look away from the faces of neighbors who had waited 20 years for this exact moment. Grace then turned the offer toward him personally, extending a position as head of a newly restructured division of the company, along with a substantial financial settlement meant to address decades of lost recognition. Cameron listened respectfully, then declined both offers without hesitation. He wanted no title, no corner office, no sum of money that could never truly repay what had been lost. Instead, he made a single request. Rebuild the research center, he said, and let it serve the town the way it always should have. Train young engineers who might otherwise never have the chance. Give Cedar Point back its purpose, not through charity but through real opportunity. Grace agreed on the spot, and the crowd's applause rose again, louder this time, filling the square with a kind of hope the town had not felt in a generation. Standing among the cheering townspeople, Grace found herself watching Cameron rather than the reaction around her, understanding that the man refusing every reward was exactly the reason this moment mattered as much as it did. In the months that followed, Grace found reasons to return to Cedar Point far more often than her schedule strictly required. What began as oversight of the research center's reconstruction slowly became something else entirely. Visits that stretched longer than necessary, conversations that wandered well past the boundaries of business. She and Cameron worked side by side, reviewing blueprints, interviewing prospective engineers, and walking the grounds of the facility as it rose slowly from years of neglect back into something purposeful. The distance that should have existed between a billionaire executive and a quiet former engineer seemed to dissolve more with every visit, replaced by an easy familiarity neither of them had expected to find. One late afternoon, as they stood watching the sun lower itself toward the water, Grace found herself asking a question that had been sitting with her for weeks. "Have you always lived this simply?" she asked, watching him carefully. "Even knowing everything you could have had?" Cameron considered the question before answering, the way he considered most things, without rushing toward a response that had not been fully thought through. "The most valuable thing I have ever owned was never money," he said finally. "It was time with people who mattered, and the chance to keep a promise that meant something." Grace felt the words settle into her differently than she expected, touching something she had spent years keeping carefully guarded. She had built an empire chasing power and precision, certain that success required exactly the kind of relentless ambition she had mastered so completely. Standing beside a man who had walked away from everything she had spent her life pursuing, she understood for the first time that she had been searching for something else entirely, something she could not have named until now. It was not power she wanted beside her. It was someone whose worth had nothing to do with what he owned or controlled, someone whose quiet integrity had outlasted every attempt to erase it. She had spent her whole career surrounded by people angling for advantage, and here was a man who wanted nothing from her at all, who had refused every reward she offered without a moment of hesitation. Their relationship deepened slowly, built through shared work rather than grand gestures, through long conversations over blueprints and long walks along the shoreline as the research center took shape around them. There was no dramatic declaration between them, no single defining moment that changed everything. There was only a steady accumulation of trust built one honest conversation at a time between two people who had finally found in each other something neither had expected to need. A year after that first meeting at the airport, the research center in Cedar Point stood completed, its glass windows catching the afternoon light, its laboratories filled with the quiet hum of work that had returned to a town that once believed such purpose was gone forever. Young engineers moved through the halls with notebooks and quiet determination, many of them children of families who had left Cedar Point decades earlier and had now come home to build something new. The town itself had begun to change alongside the facility. Shops that had stood empty for years reopened along the main street. Families who had scattered across the country in search of work found reasons to return, drawn by opportunity that had not existed here in a generation. Cedar Point, once a forgotten dot on the map, had become something worth visiting again, something worth believing in. Grace had stepped away from day-to-day operations at Whitmore Aerospace, restructuring her role into something closer to a strategic partnership, trusting the company's daily leadership to executives who had proven their integrity through the long investigation. She spent much of her time now in Cedar Point, working alongside Cameron, who had taken on the role of research director exactly as he had once hoped he might, all those years ago, before everything had been taken from him. On the day the center formally opened its doors to the public, the town gathered once more in the same square where Grace had made her confession a year earlier. Speeches were given, ribbons were cut, and reporters captured images that would run in publications far beyond the borders of Oregon. But amid all the ceremony, it was a quieter moment that mattered most. Grace found Cameron standing near the edge of the crowd, watching young engineers examine the new laboratories with wide-eyed enthusiasm, and she felt something settle inside her that she had spent a lifetime chasing without ever quite finding. She did not need grand words to express what that moment meant. She simply reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his in full view of the gathered crowd, townspeople and reporters and old friends alike. Cameron looked down at their joined hands, then up at her face, and smiled in a way that needed no explanation. Around them, Cedar Point continued its quiet return to life, built not on the ashes of what had been taken, but on truth finally spoken, trust patiently rebuilt, and two people from entirely different worlds who had found, against every likelihood, a future they could build together, one honest day at a time. What began as a simple question at an airport information desk became something neither Cameron nor Grace could have predicted, a reckoning with the past and an unexpected beginning built on honesty rather than power. Cedar Point stands today as proof that truth, however long buried, can still find its way back into the light, and that the people who deserve credit for their work will eventually receive it, even after 20 years of silence. Cameron never wanted recognition, and Grace never expected to find someone whose worth had nothing to do with wealth or status. Together they rebuilt more than a research center. They rebuilt trust, purpose, and a future neither of them had thought possible. If this story moved you, share it with someone who still believes in second chances, and remember that quiet integrity often outlasts every attempt to erase it.